Okay, so we are recording. So I wanted to welcome each one of you to our event this evening. Thank you for coming out, or actually staying in is what you're doing. So thanks to each one who's decided to attend. Before we get going with the main event, which is Dr. David Livingstone sharing with us this evening, a couple of announcements for you. First of all, I wanted to remind you of our speaker series, which is a fundraiser that we are doing to raise funds to bring in a list of speakers that we hope will be encouraging to you and also help you in your work as good citizens of this country. The other thing alongside the speaker series is we're also asking for your speaker suggestions as well as topical suggestions. Please see our website and you can let us know what your thoughts are for that. Beyond that, we would ask you to consider joining Freedom Defense Canada if you haven't already. Your support, both financially and in every other way, is a real help to us and enables us to do the work that we're doing as an organization. So the other thing I would encourage you to do is to support our social media presence. We have a Facebook page where there's posts regularly. If you would like, comment and share, that would be wonderful. We also have a YouTube channel. We'd ask you to subscribe to that and also subscribe to our Substack and Rumble channels. These are just different venues for you to check us out on. We'd appreciate your involvement in that. So at this time, I'm going to hand back to Perry, who's going to give some explanation of Zoom etiquette and about the question and answer that we'll have afterwards. So Perry, back to you.
Thanks, Mike. Great introduction, and thank you for giving it. And so I'm going to explain the etiquette, or the way in which we go about these presentations, so it's clear and everything will go smoothly. So in order to create an atmosphere of respect, we ask that you mute your mics. After the presentation, we're going to be having a Q&A session, always interesting. And then I will be explaining all the details of how that Q&A session will take place at a certain point later on in the presentation and event. So that's all I have to say at this particular time. So back to you, Mike.
Okay, thanks, Perry. At this point, I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight. We're pleased to have with us this evening Dr. David Livingstone. Dr. Livingstone is a professor of liberal and political studies at Vancouver Island University in Nanaimo. He has published widely in various venues, from academic journals to opinion pieces. I have read him in the Epoch Times, among other papers. For tonight's event, Dr. Livingstone will be speaking about the forces that are attempting to suppress Canada's history, everything from critical race theory to equity, inclusion, and diversity. As we all know, these are very familiar terms to us, sadly. But in any case, Dr. Livingstone is going to have as his main focus Thomas D'Arcy McGee, who is a famous Canadian historical figure, who, if you don't know anything about him, you're going to learn in a few minutes. But D'Arcy McGee could be swept away in the ongoing purge of our country's rightful and truthful history. So with that said, Dr. Livingstone, welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight. Take it away.
Okay, thanks for having me. I'll just take a second to share this presentation. I've got a few PowerPoint slides that I thought I would share with people as we move along, because it's probably more interesting than looking at me for the entire time. And I've also written up some of the comments that I want to share with you guys. So if you see me in the image looking in the other directions, because I got another computer and the screen's over there that I'm going to be looking at to consult. First of all, is the sound still okay? Can you hear me okay? Excellent. Okay, thanks. Well, I do have to say that I am not an expert in Canadian history, even though I'm going to be talking about Canadian history. I teach in liberal studies and also in political studies. That's actually two different departments at Vancouver Island University. A lot of people know what political studies is, or at least they have an idea of what that is. Liberal studies, they often scratch their head. They don't know what that is. So I'll just spend a half a second just explaining what that program is. We can sort of refer to it as a Great Books program. And that's what drew me actually back to Canada. I was studying in the United States, and I'm originally from Alberta, but I did want to return to Canada. And there was this little Great Books program sitting there on the West Coast in Nanaimo. And I managed to get into that program and loved it ever since. And so we study everything from the Old Testament, the New Testament, some of the Greek tragedies, philosophy, politics, poetry, the Renaissance, you name it. So it stretches us pretty widely, but it's a fascinating program to teach in. But one of the costs of teaching in a program like that is you end up over the years not being an expert in anything. You sort of get to dabble in lots of different things. But one of my interests has been Canadian politics and Canadian history. And I really became quite interested in Thomas D'Arcy McGee. So I want to talk a little bit about what I've learned about his ideas for Canada. So one of the things I want to talk about, I want to make a distinction between two kinds of nationalism. And I'll suggest that Thomas D'Arcy McGee is interesting to us, or should be interesting to us, because he was aware of both of these forms of nationalism, and he chose one for us as an alternative to the other. And I think he chose quite wisely. And so many years ago, I read an interesting little book, maybe some of you are familiar with it, by the Civil War historian James McPherson. And the book was titled, Is Blood Thicker Than Water? And in that book, McPherson helpfully defines the two forms of nationalism that I'm referring to. And so the first kind McPherson refers to is ethnic nationalism, which he describes as a sense of national identity and loyalty shared by a group of people united amongst themselves and distinguished from others by one or more of the following factors: language, religion, culture, and most importantly, a belief in the common genetic or biological descent of the group. So that's ethnic nationalism. That's one form. But that's to be distinguished from another form of nationalism, which McPherson calls civic nationalism. And this nationalism, he says, really comes down to this point. What holds a society together is not common roots, but law. Now, in addition to these two forms of nationalism, I also have another point in mind, which may be a bit more obscure, but I want to touch on it, even if just obliquely. And I think it's something which is also hovering in the background of McGee's thinking, but it's not quite so prominent, so I may not spend quite as much time on this. But I'm going to refer to a contemporary scholar, Richard Velkley, who teaches at Tulane University. And he was writing an article on a different topic, but this quotation popped out and I thought it was interesting and related to McGee's work. And Velkley says, we need to remain aware of the claims of the classic philosophers that man's highest perfection is a way of life transcending the city, the life of philosophic contemplation, and that the worth of the city ultimately depends on its openness or deference to that life. Okay, so there's a claim that Velkley is making here, that there is something which transcends politics, that transcends the city. And what transcends the city is philosophic contemplation. This is an idea that we can see if we read, for instance, Aristotle's work called the Nicomachean Ethics. It's a very interesting turn towards the end of that work in Book 10, in which suddenly Aristotle refers to the life of contemplation as the highest life. There's also a sense in which, if you read another classic work, Plato's Republic, where Socrates seems to be suggesting something similar. He takes these young men, Polemarchus and Glaucon, with whom he's having a conversation about justice and so many other things, but he really kind of points them in the direction of something that can transcend politics. And my argument is McGee is also aware of this idea of something which transcends politics. And as a result, that thing which transcends politics can actually moderate politics if we keep it in mind. So again, that might sound a bit obscure, but I hope that I can kind of unpack some of these ideas as I go along, as I talk about McGee's life. So McGee's consistent reminder to Canadians is that we have to seek out the truth of things. And that is consistent, I would say, with his desire for a civic nationalism that would bind us as a community. And to lose sight of the former, to lose sight of this concern for the truth of things, is ultimately to abandon the latter, which is the civic nationalism that could bind us as a nation. So McGee was born in Carlingford, Ireland in 1825, and he had a very eventful life. When he was a young man, he was just 17 years old, he moved to the United States, and he wrote for a paper called the Boston Pilot. And he was often contributing articles about Irish politics and Irish nationalism at this time. He eventually moved back to Ireland at the height of the dreadful potato famine that was claiming the lives of many, many Irish. He started writing for the Freeman's Journal at this time, but eventually broke with the editors of that journal. And then he joined what was called the Young Ireland Movement, which was a much more radical organization. And McGee was instrumental in planning and then eventually launching a rebellion against British rule in Ireland. But the revolution didn't gain the popular support that he thought it would, and it eventually completely failed. Several of his friends were imprisoned and then eventually exiled. And to avoid the same fate, McGee fled back to the United States. And so he finds himself back in the United States. And this is the moment when the anti-immigrant know-nothing movement was becoming very powerful and very popular. As these waves of Irish Catholic immigrants are coming over, the know-nothing party begins to push back against immigration and particularly against Catholics. And you get these signs like "No Irish Need Apply" in some of the businesses. Eventually, by 1857, McGee is frustrated with what is happening in the United States. It's not turning out to be the place that's hospitable to his ideas or what he thinks should be a good political community for him and his family. So he ends up getting an invitation to come to Canada and emigrates with his family to Canada. Now, this is also a time in Canadian history when French, English, Catholic, Protestant relations are fraught and there's tensions, and they not infrequently boil over into violence as well. McGee starts another newspaper, and this one is his own newspaper, and it's called The New Era in Canada. And almost immediately, interestingly enough, he begins advocating for Canadian Confederation. He's really one of the first to start advocating publicly for this idea that the British North American colonies should come together and form a single united country. As an Irish Catholic, McGee experienced bigotry then and religious fighting over the course of his entire career in Ireland, in the United States, in Canada. So it would have been easy, I think, for McGee to have doubled down on his identity and to push for a politics that was based on resentment and ethnic nationalism, but he didn't do that. The only way to overcome the factional problems that he saw in Canada, but also in the United States, but now particularly in Canada where he's living, was by articulating, he thought, political principles that transcended group differences and then embed those principles into a new constitution for Canada. And in fact, he goes from being a young rebel to being one of the staunchest defenders of British constitutional principles, a change that even he noted as being rather remarkable. So quoting McGee, he says, "It may be said that it's rather strange for an Irishman who spent his youth in resisting that government in his native country to be found amongst the admirers of British constitutional government in Canada." He says, "To that remark, this is my reply. If in my day Ireland had been governed as Canada is now governed, I would have been as sound a constitutionalist as is to be found in Ireland." And he said that in 1863. So he makes this incredible shift in his politics from being an Irish Republican rebelling against British rule to moving to Canada and seeing how the constitutional principles were working in Canada and beginning to admire those principles. It's not the same thing as admiring Great Britain. He was admiring the principles as he saw those playing out in Canada. And that was, I think, the difference. He could see those principles being applied in a different place. Had Ireland been ruled in this way, he probably wouldn't have rebelled, is what he said. But the event that truly crystallized McGee's belief that the British colonies needed to unite under a new constitution was the American Civil War. And he says the American problem, oops, sorry, I think I'm missing a slide. The American problem is, he says, quote, "for all lovers of well-regulated liberty, a study of the deepest and most painful interest." And Canadians needed to draw lessons from it. First, McGee believed foreign powers would use divided America as a pretext to meddle in North American affairs. And he said, quote, "there is no good that can arise from the US splitting in two. It would lead to standing armies, intrigue, passports, and hostility. It may also invite European world powers to side with one or the other and to manufacture problems for their own interests," end quote. Second, and I think for him, the more important reason for opposing the South's separation from the United States and forming the Confederacy was McGee's view that the Southern Confederacy was trampling upon the true foundations of free government by asserting that one race was more important than our common humanity when it comes to defining a person's rights and identity. So McGee did not hesitate to denounce the South for rejecting America's original founding ideas, the founding ideas that I would say are enshrined in the US Declaration of Independence, says that all men are created equal. And though McGee came to believe that the Canadian regime was actually superior in crucial respects to the American regime, he nevertheless believed the United States was founded on principles intended to bring about the eventual end to slavery. And in this respect, the US Constitution and the Declaration were not, as Nicole Hannah-Jones argues in 2019, intended to extend and protect slavery. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the 1619 Project. You probably are. Okay. I think my slides got a little out of order, so you'll have to pardon me if I have to back up a bit. But Nicole Hannah-Jones in the New York Times in the 1619 Project says that conveniently left out of our founding mythology is the fact that one of the primary reasons the colonists decided to declare their independence from Britain was because they wanted to protect the institution of slavery. So she claims that the reason the Americans separate from Great Britain is to protect the institution of slavery. And independence was required in order to ensure that slavery would continue. And this is something which Darcy McGee would just flat out reject. He would be supported by a number of very qualified historians now who simply reject this thesis of Nicole Hannah-Jones. The United States was not formed in order to protect or extend slavery. Indeed, it was the South's own declarations that proved for all to see that the original Constitution was not a pro-slavery document. Yes, so this is McGee commenting on what the Southern United States, what the Confederacy, I should say, was breaking away from. What did they, in their own words, say that they were separating from and why? And from what description of government is it these Southern states are so eager to break away? By their own declaration, from a government hostile to the extension of human slavery, a government whose original sin is, in their eyes, the grand declaration that all men, black as well as white, are endowed with certain unalienable privileges, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So he is paraphrasing the Declaration of Independence there when he says all men, black as well as white, are endowed with certain inalienable privileges. And this is what the Southern Confederacy must push back against and say, we reject that. So the Declaration's principles, as far as McGee is concerned, refer to the rights of men, to human beings as such, not to rights or privileges based on accidental or inherited characteristics, such as, for instance, skin color. The truth of the Declaration applied to black as well as white, he says. And it was on that truth that McGee could see a civic identity being built, elevating the citizen's gaze above considerations primarily of race, religion, and ethnic difference. The South, by rejecting that founding, was rejecting that truth that was contained in the Declaration, that self-evident truth. The Civil War was, in effect, a war for liberty simply because, quoting McGee, quote, the dogmas of which the Republic is founded are genuine articles of every free man's creed, end quote. So he has an admiration for the Declaration. He has an admiration for those principles that the United States was set upon. And yet the Declaration, to be sure, was not read by McGee in complete isolation. It was not the sole source for, quote, the freedman's creed, end quote. McGee would have likely agreed with his contemporary Canadian legislative counselor, David Christie, who said, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are the unalienable rights of man, and to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So there is a complete quotation from the Declaration of Independence, word for word. But then he adds this last part. This is the secret strength of the British Constitution, and without a full and free recognition of it, no government can be strong and permanent. And the scholar Janet Asienstadt points out that this is sort of shocking in a certain way. Here's David Christie quoting the US Declaration of Independence and says, this is the secret strength of the British Constitution, not the American Constitution, or not the American Constitution alone, but these principles Christie can somehow find stretching back into the British constitutional history. And I think McGee has the same sort of idea in mind here. That's why he can praise the Declaration of Independence. So of the British Constitution, McGee said, it is the great original upon which must be founded the institutions of all new free states. In the spirit, I would say, of Edmund Burke, it was to this tradition, more so than exclusively to the abstract rights defended by figures such as Jefferson and Thomas Paine, that McGee's radical conservatism would eventually turn. In fact, McGee's reticence to invoke the abstract rights of man, apart from or independently from the tradition from which they arise, may explain McGee's otherwise curious substitution of the word privileges for the word rights in his paraphrasing of the Declaration and every free man's creed. Now, McGee was signaling that a proper nationalism for Canada would draw upon or acknowledge the sort of creed embodied by the Declaration, a creed which, to repeat, did not set one's rights and liberties on cultural, ethnic, religious, or racial considerations. It transcended those characteristics and rested those rights instead on a self-evident truth available to the mind. Now, while appreciating the positive contributions that ethnic, religious, and linguistic groups could make to Canada, McGee nevertheless implored each of those groups to contribute to a larger common good. Canada had already struggled in the past to accommodate French, English, Catholic, and Protestant groups. New immigrants were arriving from other parts of the world in great numbers, not to mention the Indigenous peoples who were here from the beginning. Yet McGee did not speak of assimilation as the answer either. Instead, he preferred the term amalgamation. And he says, by amalgamation, we do not understand swallowing up. We mean the union of relative natures, fit and proper to be united, in the fruits of which each constituent is represented by the good qualities he contributes to the common stock. So there still is a common stock to which these different groups ought to be contributing, and it's not assimilation, but it's amalgamation. He saw little point, in fact, in transplanting the political and religious animosities of Europe or any other place to the new soil of Canada. And he says, in fact, the result of my observations is that there is nothing to be more dreaded in this country than feuds arising from exaggerated feelings of religion and nationality. He believed that people should, and more importantly, could leave those quarrels behind. He evidently believed we are not prisoners of our unique histories and culture, nor does collective experience trump individuality and universality. And he goes on to say, if we will carefully convey across the Atlantic half-extinguished embers of strife, in order that we may by them light up the flames of our inflammable forests, if each neighbor will try not only to nurse up old animosities, but to invent new grounds of hostility to his neighbor, then, gentlemen, we shall return to what Hobbes considered the state of nature. I mean, a state of war. And I think this is very prescient given some of the demonstrations that we're seeing on our streets these days, where the animosities of other places, in a sense, are being brought over and the embers of strife have been struck again. This is precisely the sort of thing that McGee had experienced in his own lifetime and had struggled, in essence, to try to overcome with the constitutional principles that he's setting forward for Canada. So when citizens are taught, say in contemporary universities now or schools, that they cannot transcend their particular culture, ethnicity, or race, then politics becomes immoderate and censorious. And McGee understood that what transcends politics can serve to limit and to moderate politics. Modern political thought, I would say, in its effort to find a basis for recognizing different groups within a pluralistic society, often turns its back on principles like the ones McGee is putting forward. In his seminal essay, The Politics of Recognition, by the Canadian political philosopher Charles Taylor, Taylor argues that we must accommodate differences among different ethnic and cultural groups by beginning with the assumption that they are all equal to one another. This is merely, he says, quote, a presumption, however. Quoting Taylor, he says, the validity of the claim has to be demonstrated concretely in the actual study of the culture, end quote. The trick, Taylor says, is that the very measure of worth we use to validate rival and even contradictory cultural claims may itself be challenged by the group we are evaluating. Quoting Taylor again, he says, the very understanding of what it is to be of worth will be strange and unfamiliar to us. Taylor concludes that we must learn to adjust what we had heretofore taken for granted as the background to our evaluation in light of the unfamiliar criteria offered up by the other culture we are considering. And he then refers to this concept of the fusion of horizons. The fusion of horizons operates through our developing new vocabularies of comparison by means of which we can articulate these contrasts. So we have to go into this question of cultural claims within our society, assuming that all the cultures are equal until we do our examination. But even the metric, the measure by which we're going to use, the metric we're going to use to evaluate whether cultures in fact are equal or not, is subject to negotiation with those various cultures. So we don't even have a constant standard by which to make that comparison. That is also part of what's going to develop through the conversation, through the quote, fusion of horizons. But I would suggest that Taylor struggles to clarify exactly what evaluative criteria we could ever develop in that process. He warns in that same essay that it's very likely some will enter into this debate with subjectivist, half-baked, neo-Nietzschean theories, that's his term for them, deriving frequently from Foucault or Derrida, and they claim that all judgments of worth are based on standards that are ultimately imposed by and further entrench structures of power. So Taylor would like to reject that move in this quest for a fusion of horizons. He is delegitimizing this, but I'm not sure that he gives us within his own thinking a grounds for doing that. And it seems that such ideas are now prevalent, exactly those ideas. And so Taylor's fusing of vocabulary seems rather weak against this subjectivist opposition. How does one avoid sliding into this subjectivism as a result of Taylor's approach to the fusion of horizons? It's not clear to me. Arguably, critical race theory, which I am going to assume many of you know something about, critical race theory. Critical race theory offers a vocabulary that's not merely unfamiliar to, but deliberately hostile to the very regime which harbors and provides the necessary freedom to those seeking to advance critical race theory. According to a textbook written fairly recently to explain and also to advance critical race theory, Richard Delgado is one of the co-authors of this book. They say that unlike traditional civil rights discourse, which stresses incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. So it puts into question all of those things. So it does not seek to fuse with any of the current vocabularies, and certainly not one like McGee's, and understandably so. For if there is nothing but a discourse of power, if there is no higher truth to which our minds can ascend, then politics becomes merely a pushing and shoving match among different groups seeking to have their power predominate. It denies at the outset that we can strive for what McGee hoped to achieve through the Constitution for Canada namely a collective political identity, a civic identity, a political nationality. A mental union is actually another phrase that McGee uses for what he seeks. It seeks instead to replace the idea of the person and the it seeks instead to replace the idea of the person and the constraints imposed by human nature that undergirds McGee's civic nationalism. It was only when McGee had risen beyond and above, I think, his own identity as an Irish Catholic that he could recognize the worthiness of the principles undergirding the British Constitution. And he never entirely rejected that Irish Catholic aspect of his identity. That was still very important to him, but he could see that that needed, in a sense, to be put into the recesses, into the background. And he also had to overcome his reluctance to embrace the British constitutional principles on the grounds that they were British. After all, as I pointed out earlier in his life, he had risked his life in a failed effort to rebel against Great Britain. But he had come to see that the rightness of the principles was not in fact that they were British, but rather that the principles were right and they just happened to be British. The correctness of an idea is separable from its particular ethnic or cultural origin. To argue instead that race or ethnicity is what is essential to who we are, more essential than our capacity as human beings to share thoughts and ideas, would be for McGee to remain mired in or to return to the very sources of factionalism that led not infrequently to hatred and violence in Canada in the 1850s and 60s. So allow me to conclude with a quotation from McGee. He said, the quotation is actually already up there, sorry. "The object of all intellectual pursuits worthy of the name," McGee told a Montreal audience, "is the attainment of truth. It is the sacred temple to be built or rebuilt, and the Ithaca of every Ulysses really wise." So what I'm suggesting is it's this orientation towards what he calls and what he puts in capital T, truth, which is that transcendent thing that also Aristotle points to in the Nicomachean Ethics in Book 10, which rises above any particular city, any particular nation. And it's that which we should be recognizing as standing above our political communities and can also moderate it. Go back to Berkeley's quote, it's the grounds upon which the openness to that transcendent philosophical truth is the measure we can take of the worthiness of our society. If we remain open to that truth, then we can remain a worthy society. When we close ourselves off to that, then I think we're in trouble and we slide back into factionalism. That's McGee's suggestion at any rate. Final thing, McGee, of course, was assassinated. He became hated by the radical Irish, the group called the Fenians, and they saw him as nothing more than a traitor. Once he embraced British constitutional principles, he just became enemy number one. It's assumed that the Fenians sent out the assassin, and they killed McGee when he was walking back from the Parliament after delivering a speech in 1868. And there was a trial. The gentleman Whelan always proclaimed his innocence, but there was circumstantial evidence that was sufficient for the jury at that time to convict him. There was a funeral for Darcy McGee, and thousands of people turned out, and this was in Montreal. You can see the casket that was being brought down through the middle of the street there. Though his political star had started to set already by this time, nevertheless, he was extremely popular and well-loved figure. And in a population, I think, of, oh, here it is, McGee's body was returned to Montreal. There was an estimated 80,000 people who lined the streets of a city whose population was only 105,000. It was arguably the largest funeral in Canadian history. And that was in a Globe and Mail article in 2013 reflecting on McGee. And McGee, I finished with this quotation here. Again, you can see the number of people that just came out to see and pay their respects to this incredible statesman. There is at least this one public duty clear beyond doubt, he said, namely to show, both for the sake of our adopted and our native country, that it is possible, aye, that is most natural, that we should dwell together in peace as one people. Okay, well, thank you for your attention, and I'll stop the sharing, and we can presumably move to the questions.
All right, thank you very much, David. That was a very interesting expose on Mr. Darcy McGee. I think that's something I've never heard before, so I appreciate, certainly from my perspective. What we're going to do now is we're going to enable the chat box, and that way you can write your questions, and Perry will moderate that, and what he will do is look at questions, and if he feels he can amalgamate some of them, he will. But I will turn it over to Perry, and he can carry on with the question and answer period. So thanks again, David. Appreciate that.
Hi again, everyone. Okay, before I talk about the question and answer format, I just want to thank you once again, David, for giving us this overview of Darcy McGee. I see so many parallels with what he went through that we're going through. For example, identity politics of the day, that kind of thing, of fragmentation, and even the segregation we're starting to see in our world. So on to the question and answers. So you're going to do a question. Please keep your mics muted again. We'll use the chat box for questions. There's already a question up there from Rick Higgins. Depending on the number of questions, as Mike said, I'll possibly combine some of them into one question. So there may be 2 or 3 that are combined into one. So you can answer 3 people at once, basically. If the questions go well and are manageable, we'll move to open mic in a little while. So let's go to the first question then. And I encourage people just to enter their questions in the chat box. So Rick Higgins says, do you think that multiculturalism in Canada is a failed experiment? Good question. We actually had a post in Freedom of Defense Canada entitled Multiculturalism, Does It Fit Us Anymore? Surely in the mix of cultures, there should be a submission to the most ancient culture from which the nation was built. And then he has a biblical quotation here. What in truth was the great question that plagued Pilate? If the Bible is the standard and Jesus is primarily focused, how do we meld the various religions to build one nation? I think a reference to the civic nationalism that Darcy McGee spoke of. So I'll let you answer that.
Yeah, well, that certainly is tricky, because even at the time, I think McGee would have argued that it simply would have been impossible, given Quebec, what's now Quebec, Lower Canada, French society sitting right there, that there was no way that they were going to be able to impose a kind of regime that, the Americans had imposed, e pluribus unum, out of many one. We were always going to have to accommodate the differences of the French. And the way McGee hoped to do that was through federalism. He has a really interesting set of reflections on federalism, and he says that too is also a principle which is extremely consistent with free government. And so the first thing is to maintain the civic nationalism, that within the container that's created by the Constitution and by those principles that he was articulating, that the differences can still take place, they can still flourish, but the one thing they cannot do is to undermine the constitutional principles within which that peaceful accommodation can take place. And then federalism was one more level of that I didn't get a chance to touch on, in which communities could begin to decide for themselves how they wish to live. And so there wouldn't necessarily be just a one-size-fits-all answer that was coming from Ottawa. So I think he hoped for that. Has it failed? Maybe so, but I would argue it's failed only because we have not done a good enough job of articulating to our young people McGee's argument. That there is a civic nationalism and that we owe deference to that.
Right, yeah. The fundamental kind of nationalism we used to think existed. Now, Mike says the next question: how does Darcy McGee's idea of amalgamation relate to the current idea on display in Canada of multiculturalism. So what are your thoughts on multiculturalism? I think multiculturalism is becoming a more and more contentious issue around the world right now, right? With migration, immigration, and so on, straining the fabric of things. But what are your thoughts on multiculturalism?
Yeah, again, I might be repeating myself too much, but I think I do find something quite interesting and maybe hopeful in what McGee's talking about, because he did go through what seems very similar to what we're talking about: waves of immigrants coming over, being disrupting in a certain sense a community in which they arrive, and there's violence that breaks out. He's very worried that what they're doing, as well as they're bringing over all of these disputes that they are, in a sense, running away from as they leave Europe, as they leave different places. They arrive here, and then they just want to repeat the same kind of politics, and they begin to make this society as bad as the one they left, in a way, right? And I think I read, was it in the Globe and Mail recently, there was an article where somebody, it was an editorial or an opinion piece, and they were saying, look, you basically have to leave your shoes at the door. When you come in as an immigrant to the country, you're more than welcome, but you have to sort of leave your baggage at the door and come in and be willing to embrace, again, the liberal democratic principles by which we have decided that this society will run. And so where I think we run into problems is we're just not able to articulate that limit anymore. We just have lost confidence in saying, we have a society, you're welcome to join, but on these conditions. The conditions are, there is a constitution, there is the rule of law, there are these principles. Our multiculturalism, I think, has gone so far, and the universities have certainly played a role in this, that we now say, well, come and, if you wish, from your particular standpoint, go ahead and criticize the liberal democratic principles themselves and work towards undermining them. And that too is one of your fundamental freedoms. And I think that's where McGee would just sort of draw a line and say, no, that's just simply not going to work. That's just going to lead to the factional violence that he experienced in Canada when he first arrived. And the reason for which he said we needed a constitution was to get out from under that.
Great.
I don't know if that's very satisfactory, but
Oh, it sounds more than adequate. And considering the fact that a lot of people are experiencing that clash of civilizations or cultures in Europe in particular, right? That's really apropos. So we have two more questions at the present. So from Edward Field, one of the quotes from McGee includes the following confusing phrases: British government is a government hostile to the extension of human slavery, and thus is contrary to the American Revolution's aim of freeing slaves. So the question. Maybe Edward, perhaps you're asking how these two contradictory ideas can be within one quotation or one of the quotes. So how does this work? That's what Edward just said. So to go back here. Yeah, I'll read it again. One of the quotes from McGee includes the following confusing phrases: British government is a government hostile to the extension of human slavery, and thus is contrary to the American Revolution aim of freeing slaves. How does that work? That's what he says.
Maybe I misquoted that. I think I was trying to suggest a continuity between those rather than a contrast. So I think what McGee was saying is the Declaration of Independence was consistent with the British constitutional principles in that both would have been aligned against slavery. And so what's in a way kind of surprising to the scholar Janet Asienstadt is this connection between the Declaration and the British constitutional principles. So McGee doesn't have to make a choice between those. He can have both. He can say, I appreciate this about America, the Declaration of Independence, which says all men are created equal. And I can also appreciate the tradition, the British tradition, out of which I see those principles arising. And I'm going to try to incorporate those British principles into the new Canadian Constitution and enshrine those in the British North America Act. So I hope that clarified it.
Yep, Edward's nodding, so that's good.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, from Amanda, how can Canada get back to basic first principles that McGee subscribed to?
That's the $1 million question, isn't it? How do we do that? You know, it's sort of like Pandora's box is open and we don't know how to get it closed and we don't know how to get back to this. One hopeful sign I've noticed is that there's quite a lot of interest, it seems like I've not seen before, in this question of civic education in Canada, both at the K through 12 level and also at the university level. There seems to be a recognition that our politics has gotten so divided. And people have different reasons for why they think it's divided. You know, some people say social media. I think that's to blame for some extent, lots of different reasons. But at least there's one thing that's happening. There's a lot of people interested in having this conversation now about how come our young people don't seem to know anything about how the government is supposed to work or what the Constitution is, or these principles like the rule of law. When I'm teaching my politics first year course, one thing that really gratifies me but also scares me is at the end of the course, I quite often have students come up to me and say, I really appreciated this course. I really learned a lot, but I didn't know any of that before we started. And I'm talking some really basic, this is the House of Commons. This is what's supposed to go on at the House of Commons. And they're gobsmacked. They have no idea about any of it. But when they go through it, they're usually quite interested. And they're like, wow, this is really cool. Canada's kind of it's not a bad place. We got our faults for sure. And there's all this, but I kind of feel proud about the country now. Thanks. So what's hopeful is that if you present this information, they actually sort of like it and they want more of it and they become more interested. But what's scary is they don't have any of the background at all. So we need somehow to get that turned around. I'm in conversations right now with another scholar in Ontario who is going to be launching a national conversation on civic education. I don't know how big that's going to be. He's got big grand plans for this. I don't know where it'll go, but I just find it fascinating that lots of people are thinking about this now in different places. So again, I hope that somewhat answered the question. I think we have to get back to it by returning to proper civic education. I'll add this too. I mean, there's civic education. That's just sort of the bare bones, like I was talking about the Constitution and, you know, how did the Charter of Rights come about and what are its issues and problems, if you want to refer to it that way. But the Great Books program that I teach in, I find is also a deeper form of a kind of civic education as well, where we go through the philosophic roots in a way of some of these ideas. We really get the students thinking deeply about where these ideas of politics come from. That too, I think, is missing from a lot of people's education. So I hope that our Great Books program can exist where, you know, it's trying times at the university, as Richard can probably attest to. The budget situation we keep hearing is terrible. And I just hope that, you know, certain administrators don't decide that this pesky little Great Books program that's keeping all these dead white guys alive for such a long time would be a really convenient time to get rid of it. So we'll see.
That opens up a real can of worms about people's perceptions of scholars and white people and all those other things. But anyway, I as an ex-high school teacher who taught social studies for 28 years, I can attest to the fact that some of the things that you would expect them to come to your university classes with as fundamentals were bled out of the system. You know, I mean, and I think that's, you know, for example, the conferences leading to Confederation, who John A. Macdonald was, you know, at the beginning of my teaching career, I would show these old films of the Pacific Scandal, you know, 1872 and stuff. But I'm certain that those things probably are not there, and maybe under the weight of social justice, some of those have been removed. But anyway, let's go on to some more questions. From Rick to you: if Muslims come here and wish to implement Sharia in a nation like our own, do I have the right to be outraged? That's a good question, because a lot of this is playing out in other parts of the world. So,
right. Do you have the right to be outraged? Yeah, that's a really interesting question, isn't it, these days? Because we have, I think we've taken the idea of tolerance and then we've spun it just a little bit. Well, maybe not more than just a little bit. So tolerance, of course, used to be that I would respect your opinion, but I didn't have to agree with it. Now, I think the idea of tolerance has been extended so that to tolerate another group requires that you actually validate their position. And that, I think, is where we've gone wrong. I don't think that that's necessarily a logical extension of the principle of tolerance. So personally, yes, I think you have a right to be outraged. But will that be supported in today's climate? Probably not. That's where we run into problems. So then what happens is individuals just self-censor. They'll either say, well, then I won't express any opinion, even though I disagree with somebody. I don't want to take the risk of saying that out loud because I'm not confident that I would be protected by the laws that are there to protect me. I don't know for certain that the Charter of Rights, which says that I've got a fundamental right to freedom of expression, will actually support the position or my ability to voice my ideas. And I think that's very, very damaging, because then what you're doing is you're planting the seed of doubt in people's mind about exactly those principles, those fundamental principles, which were supposed to be the ones that united us as a nation, right?
Right. I'm going
Losing
to go
confidence in
to,
us.
sorry about interrupting you there. I'm going to go to, sorry, to open mic at this particular point. There's a couple of questions, but I'd like people to get prepared for that. So if you want to ask David a question directly, you can go to the reactions section at the bottom of your computer, or at the top of your computer, and use the raise the hand icon. We do that because a hand like this is sometimes indistinguishable and people get skipped over. So if you want to ask a question of David, please get ready to do that. And then there are a couple of questions we missed here, and I'll just take a look at them. Edward said, you mentioned Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics, I think you mentioned. Which works of Aristotle will you recommend as part of this discussion? Just very briefly, so we can move on to the open mic. Which of his works would you recommend?
I teach, well, I've taught the Nicomachean Ethics, and I also teach sections from his work, The Politics, which the students find very difficult, but often quite interesting and quite revealing, some of the things that he points out. They come to recognize that there are points of view that Aristotle has arrived at which are not consistent with his own time. For instance, he puts a big question mark behind slavery. He has, I think, an argument for why slavery, as it would have been practiced in Athens, was a violation of nature, of telos in a way. And they're often surprised by that, because they come into university with a default set of assumptions. One of them is this idea that's called historicism, which is that everybody's ideas are somehow an outgrowth of their historical time period, and that it would be impossible for a thinker to think beyond the bounds of the categories of thought that that historical period enshrines that person in. And so what that does, actually, strangely, is it gives the students a kind of strange overconfidence in their own position, because essentially what they're saying is anyone in the past is stuck in the past, and a corollary of that, and we've made so much progress. So simply by the virtue of the passage of time and the fact that they have come last in chronology, they can assume that they are wiser than Aristotle, which, if they just read Aristotle and I ask them a couple of questions, that opinion craters pretty quickly. And I sort of love doing that, like just sabotaging their self-confidence. What gives you this great confidence that you're much wiser than Aristotle just by the stupid luck of being born later than him? So anyways, The Politics is great. I think that's a fantastic work.
Okay, great. And I'm just looking to see if people's hands are raised at all. Not really seeing any of the hand icons coming up. So what I will do is go back to another question that was given to us by Petrushka. And this question is, Os Guinness in the Magna Carta of Humanity suggests that we must return to Sinai's revolutionary faith. What do you think of this?
I might need a bit more explanation of that.
Yeah.
Uh,
I think, Petrushka, are you there? Do you want to raise your hand maybe and explain? You can demute your mic. And I've got your picture here, so just to mute yourself and. Oh, there you are. Okay, so maybe, I think your mute mic is.
Okay, am I here? Am I on now, Perry?
Yeah, yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, he's suggesting the contrast between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. So he calls it Paris versus Sinai, because the American Revolution had good at its heart, whereas the French Revolution was license. It was corruption, and he says what we're seeing now in our culture, in the States especially, is the result of the French Revolution. And he states that the Sinai Revolution, so the Exodus, is the way we need to go. So I didn't know whether you had any knowledge of that or not. It sounds really good, and I recommend the book.
Yeah, it's not one that I'm familiar with, so I might jot down the name of it and
Yeah.
try to look for it. What was the author's name again? It's
Os Guinness,
Os Guinness. Okay.
and it's the Magna Carta of Humanity.
Right. Okay.
But I'm curious about this, the difference between the two revolutions, like the
Right.
rationale behind both of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm certainly I'd have to say I've not dug into that enough to be able to give you a good answer. I would just return again to McGee, for lack of anything better at the moment, because McGee, he read Edmund Burke, and Edmund Burke was very critical of the French Revolution.
Yes.
Whether it's on the same grounds as Os Guinness, obviously I wouldn't be able to say right now, but Edmund Burke had criticized that as just being set too much on abstract right and not enough, not taking into consideration the wisdom of tradition. And so again, I think maybe there is a parallel to this. And McGee then looks to the United States and he can see those abstract rights again sitting there in the Declaration. So you'd think, oh, this is the same thing as the French Revolution. There is no difference. They're both set on abstract rights. They're both opposed to tradition. And yet McGee doesn't see it that way. I am really intrigued, and I want to dig into this a bit more. It's a very subtle point, but when he paraphrases the Declaration of Independence, he replaced the word rights with the word privileges, which is a very Burkean kind of word to use. And so it's almost as if he wants to rewrite it so that it is more consistent with the Burkean understanding of a tradition that carries wisdom with it, as opposed to resting simply on abstract right. So interestingly, you might be pointing to something here via Os Guinness, that McGee is doing something kind of clever. He's sort of importing the Sinai tradition, if that's what we want to call it, into the Declaration of Independence to save it from being too much like the French Revolution.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's great.
Okay, just looking to see if there are any more hands up. And then I have a question of my own, because what I've noticed is a certain sharp severity to politics these days that, you know, anyone who is over a certain age remembers a very different kind of Canada, right? In which people were not separated by their identity politics or by race. And it's rather shocking for a lot of us, I think, who had the original idea of civil rights, the civil rights, Martin Luther King sort of concept of the content of character rather than the color of skin. But I just see us drifting further apart from that. And, you know, and I'm wondering whether justice is really served by some of the currents that are happening today, and how you feel about it working in the university classroom. And maybe Richard would be able to relate to this as well. I'm not counting the high school classroom, and that's much more fundamental clay, but you know, you have to work in a classroom where people may be coming in with ideas about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, almost like with a religiosity that you might not even see in other venues, and also CRT, critical race theory, right? Without understanding. So, what's the effect on you, and maybe perhaps Richard, on your university classrooms because of the influence of these two ideologies?
Yeah, it is something that, like a lot of other professors, been confronting this in a way that I didn't when I first got here in 2005. In 2005, you were just dealing with all sorts of other issues, you know, students not knowing enough background knowledge and how those were very basic things. This is a completely different game that we're in now, it feels like. The way that I've been dealing with it is to continue to teach the books that I have always taught, and to try to do so in a way which is not browbeating the students, not sort of saying, okay, here's a book and what we're going to do is we're going to use this to demolish critical race theory, or we're going to use this to, because I think that that's not going to work either. I think the students sort of cotton onto it pretty quickly that, oh, this is just, this, you're just being ideological as well. You just have a different ideology and you're trying to force it down our throats. So I don't know that my approach is necessarily working because what happens is you open up the conversation. You say, look, we have to be fair to both sides. We got to look at this side. We got to look at this side. I'm teaching a course right now where we're going to look at John Locke. We're going to look at James Madison, but we're also going to look at Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and we're also going to look at the Communist Manifesto, and then we're going to look at Thomas Sowell, and we're going to see a lot of different perspectives, and the students have to wrestle through all of them. I think that's what teaching should be. The problem is, I find that on a campus, the students aren't necessarily getting alternative viewpoints in every other classroom. Maybe they are, I don't know, but I'm not super confident that that's happening. So they'll get, in my class, they'll get, you know, half or more than half of the course, which is going to be material which might challenge some of these ideas of DEI and everything else. But then I don't know what's going on in the rest of the other 5 classes they're enrolled in, right? And so the perspective they get from a Locke or a Thomas Sowell might just get completely washed away in the sea of other things that they're swimming in. So I'm not sure what the right answer is. You know, I've sometimes thought, well, no, what I need to do then is just be, maybe what I'll do is I'll just be that annoying professor who is just clamoring for the other side, and that's all I present, right? At least then they'll be more balanced, because if they take my class, it's just 13 weeks of opposition, and then they can go to the other classes and they can get, you know, the more dominant position. I don't think that would work. I think ultimately the students would just reject me. I think they'd just say, no, you're just, you know.
Yeah. We have one more question.
Mhm.
And then I just wanted to bring to people's attention. I think his name is Warren Smith or something like this. He just released a YouTube video where he has an engagement with a student who comes in talking about transgenders' rights. And he doesn't condemn transgender rights, but he uses critical thinking.
Right.
And the student at the end of it says, well, I'm really embarrassed. I guess I knew nothing when I came in here. It's almost like a Socratic dialogue, you know, like, so
Right.
now Locke, do we know the meaning of justice, or something like that. But the reality of the matter is that has garnered 33 million views. 33 million. Some
Yeah.
people have a hunger for you know, honest critical thinking. From Ken and Irene Oakes to you, are we now being left with being a reactive society? Oh, okay, and then Richard had his hand up, but I didn't notice it. Oh, Edward, and sorry, just getting a handle on things here. So Richard, did you have a question before?
Yeah, I was going to respond to just a couple of things there. First, I think, David, you need to know that your approach is working, and I think it's working at VIU precisely because the Great Books program presents truths that do transcend the nonsense of DEI and CRT. And a lot of students do talk about your course or your courses, and I'm not just saying that here, I'm saying it publicly. So that's something worth thinking about. I did have 2 questions. So one is that going back to truth as that transcendent thing, on an upper level course recently, I taught that that truth could be logos, and then we battled out the difference between logos with a small L from the classics and logos with a big L from John 1:1, and that was a very productive approach. So I just wondered what you thought about kind of bringing in logos in that way. But the second thing I'd like to just articulate is maybe the Great Books program has to go underground. FDC has a really interesting presentation or panel presentation on the book Live Not by Lies, which looks at the way in which some of these kinds of approaches and courses need to go into underground cell structures and so on to survive. Yes, a bit of a messy comment there, but yeah, I don't know if you got any thoughts there.
Yeah, I am certainly open to the big L logos, that's for sure. And my students are sometimes shocked that that's even entertained in the classroom as a live possibility. We'll do it. For instance, if we're reading Dante's Divine Comedy, of course, pedagogically, how do you present that to the students? You say, well, we're going to read this just as an epic poem. It's an important epic poem written in the 1300s, kind of on the doorstep of the Italian Renaissance. But we're reading it as poetry. We're reading it as an epic poem, but it's got a lot of theology in it. And the students are going to come across that and they're going to have to think about it. Now, I'm not sort of like forcing it down their throat and saying, we're going to do theology now, but it's there and they have to think about it and they have to start to connect some of the dots, and some of them get quite fascinated. So I think that also the transcendent, McGee certainly had that in mind as a very devout Catholic at the end of his days. So I'm assuming that's what you meant by the big L, but maybe there were other concepts in there. The underground, interesting. My thesis, my master's thesis that I wrote under Professor Leon Craig at the University of Alberta many years ago was on Nietzsche. It's on Schopenhauer's Educator, and there was a passage in there where Nietzsche says, you know, all these people who have the plaque outside their door that says philosopher, you know, the philosophy department and the philosopher this. He says, if you want to find out who the real philosophers are, I would persecute all of them and see who remains to actually do any real thinking. The rest of them will just bugger off, right? So maybe this is the moment. Maybe this is the moment, Richard, where we find out who the real philosophers are. We're being persecuted. We're going to have to go underground. We're going to have to figure this out some other way. There's also, of course, these movements to set up alternative institutions, which I'm kind of intrigued by. Part of me is heartbroken by it because I think that might just still fracture and splinter. And it will, the argument that you use to legitimate starting these other institutions, be they schools or little universities or whatever, will be used by other groups to do the same thing. And they'll set up institutions that are going to be going 180 degrees in the opposite direction. Well, maybe that's just the way it's got to go. I don't know, but.
Okay, thank you.
And I would like to go back to the original question by Ken and Irene Oakes, and then over to Edward. He had his hand up, but the original question was, are we now being left with being a reactive society? I suppose that means, are we reacting all the time to this ideological pressures we're getting?
Yeah, that's interesting. I suppose that's maybe part of being a conservative, is that you're not always out there trying aggressively to push for change. You're sort of like, well, this is not the perfect society, but what we have is pretty good, and so let's enjoy it. But the other side, the other side of the political spectrum is always looking for change. So they're always taking advantage of a situation to advance something new, right? And so yes, I think that's the plight of being conservative, is that we're always reacting to a bunch of other people who are saying, oh, this isn't quite perfect, so let's tear it all down and let's replace it with this other thing. The problem too, as other people have pointed out, is that now, maybe because of social media and other things, it only takes about 7 or 8% of the population to be really noisy and seemingly to speak on behalf of a much larger percentage of society. And so I think that's where our problem is. We're reacting to smaller little splinter groups that are very extreme sometimes in their ideas. We're wondering, how did these people get so much traction? How did they get so much influence?
Oh, yes.
But we underestimate, I think, the degree to which the moderate middle is not going in that direction. So, organizations like maybe like FDC, or another organization I'm a part of, Civitas. If you guys are familiar with Civitas, we have our conference coming up in April in Vancouver. I invite you guys to check that out. We're always thinking, like, how do we connect more Canadians together so that they can sense a feeling of solidarity, that no, we don't need to always react to these little fringe groups. We need to just kind of marginalize them and park them. Yeah, so.
And Edward, I think that you had your hand up. Did you want to ask a question? Demute and ask a question then.
Sure. In your view, why would McGee be attacked or discredited today?
Well, probably because he had not gone far enough in the direction of acknowledging, not acknowledging, the word I'm looking for is validating the different ethnic and cultural groups that make up Canada. He was really pushing for these groups to bracket those things that made them distinct from other Canadians. And I think we are so aggressively moving in the other direction, where those things are supposed to be brought to the fore. And that is what your identity is supposed to be defined by. So I think he would get in trouble for that. I don't think, yeah, I think, this idea, because Perry, you brought it up before, the idea that for Martin Luther King Jr., the colorblind society, it's not the phrase he used, but this idea that should be judged by the content of your character, not the color of your skin. And that could now, in our day and age, be called a racist position, as some people have identified it. They say that itself is racism, because what it does, they say, is it erases and ignores my identity as a Black person, as a Hispanic, whatever, is, to my mind, not helpful. And then on that ground, I think McGee could be criticized, because he would say exactly that, is no, that's not how you should be identified. We should go back to the Martin Luther King Jr. approach. That's what I think McGee saw in the Declaration so clearly.
Fascinating questions, guys. Great answers, a great presentation. I think we're at 8:14 at this particular point. So next, I think we're going to spotlight Mike. Okay, remove my spotlight and wrap up the presentation. I think that's what's on next on our schedule.
Okay, thank you, Perry, and for ably negotiating through the questions and engaging that way. And most especially, thank you for Dr. David Livingstone for joining us this evening for your insightful presentation. Wonderful history lesson and plenty to think about. So, David, thank you so much for joining us. And thanks everyone for your participation tonight. It was a blessing to see you all here on the screen. And I want to leave you with a couple of things. First of all, for those of you who are not members of FDC, I'd encourage you to join FDC. And if there's people that you know around you who would be benefiting from FDC's work, please do that as well, because your support of us and your financial contributions allow us to keep doing what we're doing. So please consider that, and also consider subscribing to our Substack and Rumble channels on the net as well. So once again, from the rest of us at FDC, the board, and the members, we want to thank you for coming and bid you all a good night. Thanks, everyone. Bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great work, guys. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
All
Thank you,
right.
David.
Thanks,
Okay,
Dave.
bye.
Good night.
Bye.